You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is Kerri Maher, whose latest work of historical fiction, The Paris Bookseller, spent 4 weeks on the Indie Bestseller List and was just named a USA Today Bestseller. After having written about Kathleen Kennedy and Grace Kelly, surprisingly, it was the Paris Bookseller's Sylvia Beach that Kerri was most intimidated to write about. Although, as founder of the original Shakespeare and Company, close friend of Ernest Hemingway, and influential supporter of James Joyce, perhaps it's not hard to see why. Please allow me to introduce Kerri Maher, author of The Paris Bookseller. Hello, Kerri. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, I am so excited to be here and chatting with you today.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about The Paris Bookseller. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, so I am a writer-teacher who I live outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and I write historical fiction. The Paris Bookseller is my 3rd historical novel. My first one was called The Kennedy Debutante, about Kathleen Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's favorite younger sister. And my second historical novel was about Grace Kelly, which you sort of don't need to say any more after that, right? And I'm teaching creative writing now also at Emerson College, which is a really fabulous arts college in Boston.
Amazing. So do you have a connection to Paris or to France yourself?
Other than the fact that I love it, no, sadly, I don't have any particular family there. You know, I took French, it was my elective language in high school, but I did not take it in college or beyond that. So my ability to speak French in France is limited. It's very un petit peu. I make an effort, but I did, I got to go to Paris before the world shut down to research this novel. And it was the first time I had been there in almost 20 years. And it was just kind of a magical trip. So those are my connections to Paris and France.
I had the same thing. I studied French in high school and a little bit in college, and then I didn't for a very long time. And when I moved here, I was like, oh, it'll be fine. I speak French. And I got here and I was like, oh, no, I don't at all.
And now I'm sure it just rolls off your tongue.
I mean, sometimes.
You dream in French now?
Yeah, I think I dream in both languages. There was a period of time when I was learning where I would speak French in my dream and then correct myself, but then realize that it's me correcting me. So if I don't know, I still don't know when I'm correcting myself. So I don't know.
That's very funny.
When you were visiting the last time, were you staying in the Saint-Germain Latin Quarter area where this book is centered?
Yeah, this is actually a great little story. So I'll tell you the story. So I was I wanted to stay for a week and I really wanted to stay in the neighborhood, the 5th, 6th arrondissement where, the novel is set and sort of soak up the area. And I also was going to have a really good friend of mine who lives in London was going to come for part of the time. And so I sort of knew I needed a place with 2 bedrooms. And I was looking around, I looked at hotels, I looked at Airbnbs, and I started to really despair that there was going to be nowhere for me to stay. And I was going to have to stay much further out until the magic of the Airbnb algorithm shows me this apartment that they called James Joyce Flat, right? Other people can't see your expression, but I can. So yes, right? Oh my God. I thought that can't be true. So I click on it and lo and behold, the first picture is of a plaque on the outside of the building. These plaques that are all over Paris. It says in French, James Joyce and his family stayed here in the summer of 1921 when he was writing Ulysses. Now, so this is not a spoiler. I was already at a point in my research for the Paris Bookseller where I knew exactly which apartment this was, because not only was it an apartment where the Joyce family lived that summer, it was actually an apartment that belonged to the French poet Valérie Larbaud, who was a close, lifelong friend of Sylvia Beach. So I just thought, oh my God, like I couldn't afford the apartment. I mean, it was too expensive. It was outside of my price range. So I email, I direct message the owner and I say, I can't stay there, but this is who I am and why I'm going to Paris. Could I come and see it? And so he and I had this lovely back and forth exchange. He lowered his price for me.
Oh, wow.
And I got to stay there. So, but here's the caveat. No one knows exactly which apartment it was. So there's the plaque, but it's on the Rue Cardinal Lemoine. Please excuse my French. It's not very good, but I'm making an effort. So the way you got to the apartment was there's the main street and then there was like a gate. I assumed that there was no like key code in 1921, but I would put in a key code and a door would open and I walked up this lovely cobbled driveway and which emptied into this beautiful cobblestone courtyard surrounded by a really lovely apartment buildings with gorgeous window boxes and all the things. And I stayed in one of those apartments and I got to sort of imagine what it would have been like for Joyce to like go out with his notebook and sit in the courtyard under the trees and like write Ulysses. And also for Sylvia to visit Larbaud and like have an aperitif. And, it was really amazing. And, I sort of get up, I stumble out of bed the next morning after, sleeping off some jet lag, walk up the street and there's another one of those plaques just up the street that says, and this is where Hemingway first lived when he got to Paris. So, I was really in it. I really got to be really in it. And so, I tried to like walk all the routes that these people would have walked between their homes and the original Shakespeare and Company. So it was just terrific. The best kind of search.
That's amazing. So let's actually go back a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Paris Bookseller is about?
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, here we go. Yeah. The Paris Bookseller is about Sylvia Beach, who is the American woman who opened the original Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris in 1919. And her bookstore became really the home of the lost generation writers, all the famous expat writers of the 1920s that we know, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound, they all went to her store. Not only did they go there, some of them used the store as their post office box in Paris because they were really sort of itinerant during the time that they were there. They were moving apartments, like Hemingway was busy like skiing in the Alps. And not only that, so not as if that wasn't enough, she also published the very first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922. So we are in the centennial year. She published the very first edition of Joyce's Ulysses after it became a banned book in this major obscenity trial in 1921 that took place in New York. So that is the story of the Paris Bookseller.
So how did you first discover Sylvia Beach?
So a long time ago, actually, when I was an undergraduate in college, dreaming of becoming a writer myself, those great bargain book bins in front of college bookstores. So I was, trolling around in one of those one weekend and I found a used copy of Sylvia's own memoir, which was called Shakespeare and Company. I think it was like 75 cents. I no longer remember if I knew who she was or what the store was at that moment, like when I was 19 or 20. But I read the back of the book and basically it says Paris in the 20s. And I thought, sold. Because even then, I was kind of obsessed with the expat writers of the 1920s. That was like my favorite American literary era. So I bought the book, I take it home and I read it and I'm entranced by her story. She's this like American woman who like bravely goes to France in 1917 and she opens this wildly successful bookstore and then publishes one of the most important books of the 20th century. And I just thought, wow, like this is amazing. But, I was 20 years old, so I kind of filed it away under good to know. Fast forward 25 years, I've written 2 other historical novels. I want to keep writing historical fiction, and I sort of cast my eyes about for another subject. And I very quickly home in on Sylvia because I'm not really sure why she didn't occur to me before, but because I've been carrying her story around inside me for my entire adult life. But I'm really glad I didn't think of writing this novel first, because I think I might have been too intimidated, right? Like, I mean, putting words in the mouth of like my own literary heroes would have just been, I think, maybe too much. I like to say I had to practice with John F. Kennedy first.
I was just going to say that I don't feel like the Kennedys are a smaller mountain to climb.
I don't know. Well, when you're a writer, I don't know. I mean, listen, it was not a small thing to write about the Kennedys. It was absolutely a hurdle I had to get over in myself. But it was really good practice. I mean, I sort of have to like reckon with this with every historical novel I write, because so far I've written about real people. So I have to be like, okay, Kerri, like, it's time to, do it. And one of the tensions I really try to embrace about historical fiction, especially biographical historical fiction, is that it's my representation of these people. Like, if you were to write this same novel, these characters would be different. And that's okay. Like, this is my interpretation of James Joyce. It's my interpretation of Sylvia Beach.
Yeah, it's not a documentary.
Right, exactly.
But you did say something that relates to one of the questions I was going to ask, which is about whether or not you'd been attracted to this time period literarily.
Yeah.
And so what I want to know is, do you have a favorite author or a favorite book from this time period?
Yeah. I mean, ironically, it's not one that's set in Paris, but it's The Great Gatsby. I mean, The Great Gatsby comes out in 1925 and really defines this generation. And even though it's an incredibly American novel, I think that, I mean, I'm not gonna go all the way down this rabbit hole because I'm really not prepared. But there are ways, I think, of looking at The Great Gatsby that help us understand why this generation of writers left the United States, and so many of them went to Paris. It's often cited that Paris was really inexpensive after the First World War, which was true. So it was cheap to be a writer in Paris at this time. Oh, that was still true. Anyway, so The Great Gatsby is really my favorite 1920s novel. And S. Scott Fitzgerald did go to Paris with Zelda many times. Like, they did short residences in Paris and then also in the Riviera in the 1920s.
Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did in preparing for this book?
Well, I told you the magical story of the Airbnb. Yeah. So there's that. So, and that was really a big thing. I absolutely could have written this novel without going to Paris, but especially because I had been to Paris, I mean, when I was much younger, but I knew what it looked like. But it ultimately became really important for me to kind of have boots on the ground research experience in the neighborhoods. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was just a lot of reading. I, of course, reread Sylvia's memoir. And, I got to read it with very different, much more adult and experienced eyes. And, I also read biographies of Sylvia and some of the other, writers and his, histories of this time. A book that I had read a long time ago that I revisited was called They Were All So Young by Amanda Vale. It's about the Murphys, they were not writers, but they were Americans, the sort of wealthy Americans who lived in Paris during this time. I revisited A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. But, I also like to say about the research for this book, I could have researched this book forever and never written a word because, I'm dealing with some of the most famous American writers who left behind their own whole lifetime bodies of work. Plus, because they're so famous, many people have written about them. So I really had to kind of pick and choose what I was going to read because I had a deadline to meet, right? So I really tried to focus my efforts around Sylvia and the store. And there's less about that. One really fun research tool that I always like to point to because anybody can go and play around there is called the Shakespeare and Company project out of Princeton University, their library. So Sylvia left all of her papers to Princeton University because her father was affiliated with the college. So they have all of her handwritten library cards, which they have digitized. So you can go in and type in basically any American writer from the 1920s and 30s, because they all went there, and see what they checked out of Shakespeare and Company, the lending library portion in a particular year. Not only that, but they will also show you a picture of the library card written in Sylvia's own hand, or it could have been one of her assistants. She did have assistants over time, but it's really kind of an amazing tool. And I had a lot of fun playing around with it. It went live sort of midway through my own writing process.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. We talked a little bit about James Joyce already, and obviously his relationship, both personal and professional, with Sylvia play a big part in this story, in the development of the store and all of that. Are you a fan of James Joyce? Have you read Ulysses?
I would say first, I of course respect him and completely understand why his writing changed literature, like forever. My favorite James Joyce, though, is Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And it's something that, this is not a spoiler, but I have Sylvia also really love that book, because I think that for most readers, okay, very importantly, everyone who's listening, you do not need to have read Ulysses to read or understand the Paris Bookseller at all. Okay, really and truly. But, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I think every writer I know liked that book on some level. Like, it really speaks to young people who are aspiring to be artists of various kinds, especially writers. And I think it's much more accessibly written, which is why I wanted to draw some more attention to that novel in my novel. So I have Sylvia talk a lot about that one at the beginning. But it also kind of sets the stage for what Ulysses is and why it was so radical, in the late teens and early 20s. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I'll second that you don't have to have read Ulysses, because I haven't read it. And I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I don't think I lost anything from it.
No.
So in your research of James Joyce, was there anything that you learned about him that surprised you, or did you change your view of him in some way?
Well, I think I was actually pretty lucky that I didn't have a lot of preconceived notions about James Joyce going into it. I mean, I knew that I did not know very much about him. So, it was a process. It got to be a process of discovery. I think there were some sort of charming details about him, like he's afraid of dogs because of something happened to him when he was younger. I mean, I think it's probably pretty well known that he had eyesight problems. He was well known for his drinking. So some of those things were not surprising, but it was interesting to learn more about how just the origins of some of those things and the extent to which they influenced his life, like his eye problems, which were also related to some dental problems. I mean, he really struggled with his physical health, and it really impacted his writing. And so that was eye-opening to me. And, Sylvia, because she is such a helper of all people, but writers in particular, it was interesting to read about the ways in which she helped James Joyce through the worst of some of his physical ailments, especially while he was frantically trying to finish Ulysses, because when they agree that she's going to publish it, he has to finish it. He hasn't finished it yet. And so when he's living in that apartment that belonged to Valerie Larbaud, Valerie Larbaud has gone to the mountains or the seaside, I can't remember, for the summer, right? Which is why his apartment's available for the Joyces to live in. That summer, Joyce is essentially blind. He has a few hours of good eyesight every day. And so he's trying to finish this novel with bad eyes, I thought really interesting. And I wanted to write about that kind of thing. So I don't think people look at Ulysses as this, brilliant doorstop of a modernist novel, of course, as we should, but he really wrote it kind of against many, many odds.
Yeah, that was interesting to read about how people had to try to interpret his handwriting because his eyesight was so bad.
Yes. Well, yes. And he wrote like a third of the final novel on the page proofs.
Oh.
Which came back from the printer, which, I mean, there's a whole section about this in the novel, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But I will. But a funny piece of trivia for everybody. In today's publishing contracts, and for decades and decades, there's a clause in your publishing contract that basically says, if you change more than 10% at the page proof stage, you, the writer, will be charged to reset the type. And I like to think of this now as the James Joyce clause, because James Joyce he wrote so much of the final book on the page proofs, and it drove up the printing costs. I mean, now, resetting the type, I'm not exactly even sure how that works. I mean, I think it's still a laborious process, but I'm sure it's been digitized. But back then, it was literally like resetting, pieces of metal in a giant plate that, printed the pages.
It sounds excruciating.
I know, right? I know. I could never have a job like that. I would literally go bonkers.
No, and I'd want to murder the authors too if they were sending their work back. Yeah. So, talking about Sylvia.
Yes.
Did she ever go back to the US?
Not much. So I can't remember the exact ratio of years, but once she gets to Paris in 1917, she does not visit the United States again until, I want to say 1937. So 20 years. And it's kind of a big trip when she goes. She takes a boat across the ocean, but then she actually flies from the East Coast to the West Coast because her family has all moved to California. They live in Pasadena. She grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, but by the time she visits in the 1930s, everyone's in California, which is fun for me because that's where I'm originally from too. And also something that I relearned in my research is that Gertrude Stein is also from California.
Oh.
California at this time is really like still the Wild West. It's really way out there. Anyway, that's a total side note. So she doesn't visit very often. People come to her. I mean, her family, her two sisters and her parents frequently visit her in Paris. So I think maybe she just doesn't feel this because of that, because America's coming to her. She doesn't need to go to the States in the same way.
Yes. And you also describe her as being incredibly busy. So that also makes sense.
I think she's running a business, and, it does not make a lot of money. So it's not like she can hire a lot of staff. So she really has to be standing in that store, managing the store pretty much every day.
You describe it a bunch in the book, but can you talk a little bit about how French society would have viewed her relationship with Adrienne Monnier? It's such an interesting relationship. It seems like just this love story for the ages. How would it have been viewed by French society, maybe in contrast to the US?
Yeah, so I want to put a caveat here, which is to say I am not an expert on this, but I did do some research around this because I think many of us have this sort of intuitive idea that Paris has always kind of been this bastion of liberalism, especially at this time with Bohemian society. And, of course, Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas are this famous lesbian couple that lived in Paris for decades, essentially as a married couple. And they didn't seem to have much trouble. So I thought, and then in the course of my research, I discovered that Sylvia and Adrienne Monnier were living a very similar kind of, we'll call it married in quotation marks existence, in the left bank of Paris, this kind of bohemian quarter of Paris. And I had to imagine what that looked like and felt like. So I did a little research, and it was interesting to discover that this intuitive sense we have that Paris is this sort of magic liberal place was true. It turned out to be rooted in some real history. So, same-sex relations were decriminalized at the time of the French Revolution. So there was that. So so same-sex couples were able to kind of live in and exist in Paris in a way that they couldn't in other major metropolitan cities. The other thing that's also just true about the 1920s in all major metropolitan cities, whether Chicago, New York, Berlin, gay and lesbian cabarets and bars were all the rage. And, in Paris, they still had to kind of go if you were a woman and you were going to dress as a man, which was common, to go out to one of these places, you still had to kind of like put a cloak over your suit. And so I tried to represent that, but it was still, pretty common. And it wasn't, I don't think, met with a lot of violence or resistance. It was also the 1920s. And so just general social mores around, public displays of affection, we might say, were just different. So everyone was a little bit more discreet about their love affairs. And so I just tried to represent Adrienne and Sylvia that way. But I will tell you with regard to the research, because this was, Sylvia's relationship with Adrienne was not something that I knew to be true from reading her memoir in college, because she wrote that memoir in the 1950s for an American audience. So she did not talk in her own memoir about the truth of her relationship with Adrienne. That I discovered in the research that I did for this novel, 25 years later. So that was an interesting thing.
That is very interesting. Another thing that goes along with this that I found very interesting was the level of censorship in the US, this banning of books. I suppose it shouldn't surprise me, but do you have a sense of how different or similar the publishing worlds would have been at this time in France and the US?
Well, I don't think I can speak with any authority about the French publishing industry per se. The reason Sylvia was able to publish Ulysses in France was because Ulysses hadn't become a banned book in France. It became a banned book in America. And London, essentially, the London publishing industry was watching what happened in New York. And so Ulysses kind of became simultaneously a banned book in both places. Although I always like to point out, and I go into much more detail about this in the novel, but in 1921, during this trial, it's not the book itself that stands trial. It's two female publishers of an avant-garde literary journal, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, who are publishers of this journal that has been serializing Ulysses. And they are the ones who are convicted of publishing obscenity. But by extension, the book becomes a banned book, which is just such an interesting... It's just so interesting. But Joyce and the book don't actually stand trial in 1921. It's two women who are brave enough to be publishing it in the face of knowing that the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the Vice Squad, has it out for them. Anyway, but in Paris, which is more liberal on the literary front, although women still haven't gotten the right to vote in France at this point, interestingly. It's not a banned book. And the printer that Sylvia uses that is patiently resetting the type, although raising the price, doesn't speak English. They tell him it's a banned book and everything, but he's like, whatever, like it's not here. And so it's this very interesting, like, layers of irony about this French language printer publishing, setting the type for a book in English for essentially Sylvia's an American publisher functioning in France. And then she has to smuggle the book back into the United States, which is, another, really fun thing I got to write about in the book. So, the publishing of Ulysses in Paris really happens outside of what we might think of as the French publishing industry. She's like a rogue American publisher in Paris.
I love that. I have one last question that just occurred to me. Do you have any sense of what it was about this time period that may have lent itself to this sort of stream of consciousness writing that Joyce does and Hemingway does and Gertrude Stein wants all the credit for?
Yeah. Well, so this is modernism, right? Like, a lot of the great literary movements throughout history, it's sort of like a convergence of many things at the same time, right? And absolutely World War I played a role here. The world, or we'll call it the English-speaking sort of Western world that entered World War I, was burned to the ground by this horrible war. Virtually a generation of men die. women have to work in a meaningful way to support their families for the first time ever. We think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II, but really, it happened first in World War I, right? So we enter the roaring 20s after World War I, and the 20s was a time of trying to forget the horrors of the First World War, but these writers and other kinds of artists who lived through it were really trying to reckon with it and reckon with the fact that the world had irreparably and forever changed. And they wanted literature to reflect that change. And I'm oversimplifying a bit, but that is one of the reasons why Ulysses and Tender Buttons, and, ultimately Faulkner and, this stream of consciousness style became such an important change in literature, is that these writers were determined to show the interiority of real people's minds in all of their beauty and ugliness, right? And this is part of what gets Ulysses in trouble, right? Is that in our minds, we think about sex, we think about going to the bathroom, we go to the bathroom, Ulysses follows these characters everywhere. And that was very bold. Novels had not done that in quite the same way. And, the forces of censorship were really afraid of that level of honesty.
Are you searching for spiritual guidance? The Heart of You podcast is an exploration into your soul through intuition, spirituality, divination, and unconditional love. Host Annette DeLu is a spiritual guidance coach, intuitive, Akashic, and tarot reader who discusses practical ways to integrate spiritual growth into your everyday life. Listen now to The Heart of You on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. I feel like now is probably a good time to hear a little bit from the Paris Bookseller.
Okay, so I'm going to read from the very beginning, so it doesn't really require a lot of context. And since this is Storytime in Paris, this is very much about Paris. I'm actually going to read there's a couple of epigraphs that begin, one that begins the whole book and also part one. So the epigraph for the whole book is by Ernest Hemingway. And he says, "Paris is so very beautiful that it satisfies something in you that is always hungry in America." And then the epigraph for part one is by Adrienne Monnier, Sylvia's business and life partner. She says, "Famous people, they were not born so. One always begins by being unknown." All right, so this is chapter one. It was hard not to feel that Paris was the place. Sylvia had been trying to get back for 15 years, ever since the Beach family had lived there when her father, Sylvester, was the pastor of the American church in the Latin Quarter, and she was a romantic teenager who couldn't get enough of Balzac or Cassoulet. What she remembered most about that time, what she'd carried in her heart when her family had returned to the United States, was the sense that the French capital was brighter than any other city she'd been in or could ever be in. It was more than the flickering gas lamps that illuminated the city after dark, or that ineluctable glowing white stone from which so much of the city was built. It was the brilliance of the life burbling in every fountain, every student meeting, every puppet show in the Jardin du Luxembourg or opera in the Théâtre de l'Orient. It was the way her mother sparkled with life, read books, and hosted professors, politicians, and actors, serving them rich, glistening dishes by candlelight at dinners where there was spirited debate about books and world events. Eleanor Beach told her 3 daughters, Cyprian, Sylvia, and Holly, that they were living in the most rare and wonderful of places, and it would change the course of their lives forever. Nothing had compared, not making posters and answering phones and knocking on doors with Cyprian and Holly and Mother for the National Women's Party in New York, not adventuring in Europe solo and reveling in the spires and cobblestones of many other cities, not her first longed-for kiss with her classmate Gemma Bradford, not winning the praise of her favorite teachers. But here she was now, actually living in the city that had captured her soul. From the rooms she shared with Cyprian in the staggeringly beautiful, if also crumbling Palais Royal, Sylvia made her way down to the Pont Neuf and crossed to the other side of the Seine, breathing the wind from the river that whipped her short locks of hair across her face and threatened to extinguish her cigarette. She stopped in the middle of the bridge to look east and admire Notre Dame Cathedral, with its symmetrical Gothic towers flanking the rose window and the precariously dainty buttresses whose strength still dumbfounded her. They'd been holding up those gargantuan walls for centuries. Soon she was winding her way through the narrower streets of the Latin Quarter, which were still familiar from her adolescent wanderings. Though she got a tiny bit lost, it was happily so, because it gave her an opportunity to admire the Église de Saint-Germain-des-Prés and ask directions of a pretty French student sipping café crème at a sidewalk café at Le Deux Magots. At last, she stopped at 7 Rue de l'Odéon, the location of A. Monnier bookseller. I'm going to stop there because that's really, we didn't actually talk that much about this, but it is going to Adrienne's French language bookstore and lending library that really inspires Sylvia to open her own bookstore and lending library, Shakespeare and Company. And so that meeting of these two booksellers who, like we talked about earlier, become partners in all things is really a magic moment. So I knew that was where I had to start the book.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. I agree. It hooks you in immediately. You want to know everything that happens with them and with Sylvia and with the bookstore to be.
Yes, exactly.
So what's next for you? Do you have another historical fiction in the works?
I do, but it's a bit of a departure. It is historical fiction. So sort of happily for my travel plans, my first 3 novels starred American women who went to Europe. But my next novel is not biographical fiction, and it takes place in Chicago in the very early 1970s, and it's about an underground women's health clinic.
Oh.
Yes. It's in the early days of women's lib before Roe Wade. It's about some pretty badass feminists in the early 1970s. So, and it's also, all the characters are entirely fictional. So unlike Kit Kennedy, Grace Kelly, Sylvia Beach, all the characters are fictional, and there's 3 narrators. So I braid them together. So it's pretty different in a lot of ways. It's been a really fun challenge to write it. Oh, and it's called All You Have to Do Is Call, and it'll be out in later in 2023.
Fabulous. Well, you'll have to come back and talk to us about that one too then.
Oh, I would love to do that.
So where can people find you? How can they keep up to date with what you're doing and how to get your books and all of that?
So I am most active on Instagram, although I am also on Facebook. I have a Twitter account, but I'm going to be honest, I don't do very much there. So Instagram is really the best place to find me. I also have, and it's at Kerri Maher Writer. And I have a website, which is kerrimaher.com, which, I don't blog or anything on the website, but it has all the places to buy the books and all those things. If you do want a signed, the paperback is coming out on December 6th. My own local independent bookstore, my own Shakespeare and Company is called Wellesley Books, and you can always call them and get a signed copy. I always like to say that. I live, 15 minutes away. They're constantly saying, hey, we got an order for a signed book. Could you stop by? I'm happy to do that. And Christmas and other holidays are coming up. So if you want a signed copy of the Paris Bookseller, call Wellesley Books in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
I love that. So I'll put links to everything. I'll put a link to Wellesley Books as well so people can find everything very easily. Thank you so much, Kerri. This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun chatting with you.
Thank you again to Kerri Maher for such an excellent conversation. You can find Kerri on her website at kerrimaher.com, on Facebook and Instagram at Kerri Maher Writer, and on Twitter at Kerri Maher Books. Please join me next week for the season finale, when I'll be speaking with author and photographer Jamie Beck about her book, An American in Provence. Check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Join our book club. The Storytime Book Club welcomes authors who have been featured on this podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. For more information, including sign-up, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.